Not every life spends its hours the same way, even when the hours themselves look identical on a calendar. Two people can wake at the same time, work similar jobs, and raise their children in the same city, and still end up living, by any real measure, very differently. Not because one person was luckier, but because somewhere along the way, one of them picked up a habit the other never did. This episode gathers 45 of those habits, small, specific, and almost always older than they look. Some come from philosophers who wrote private instructions meant for no one but themselves. Some come from scientists who built an entire discovery out of nothing more than a walk repeated every day for 30 years. Some come from monks, from painters learning by copying, from a mountaineer who answered a reporter with 5 words that outlived him. None of them are secrets. Most were never hidden at all. They simply were not looked at closely, because they never announced themselves as anything more than a small private way of getting through a day. What connects them is not effort exactly, and not talent. It is a kind of attention, a willingness to notice which small, repeatable choices quietly add up to something larger, and to keep making that choice long after it stopped feeling like a decision at all. Let us begin with the first one, a private notebook that was never meant to be read by anyone. The book, known today as Meditations, was written by a Roman emperor who never meant for anyone else to read it. Marcus Aurelius composed these notes during military campaigns near the end of his life, likely along the Danube frontier in the 170s, scribbling instructions to himself between the duties of ruling an empire at war. He gave it no title. The Greek phrase later attached to it simply means things addressed to himself. He was not writing to persuade a public, or even a single correspondent. He was reminding himself, in blunt private language, to be patient with difficult colleagues, to stop caring what others thought of him, to remember that he too would die. There is no polish for an audience, no argument being built for a reader to admire. Lines contradict each other. Some are just a single repeated word of self-correction, written as if he needed to hear it twice. The manuscript survived by accident of copying, passed through Byzantine hands for centuries before reaching print in 1559, with no guarantee at any point that it would last. Modern readers often mistake it for a philosophy book, but Marcus was not explaining Stoicism to anyone. He already knew the theory backwards, and used these pages only to make himself act on it. That distinction changes how the sentences read. A line meant for a reader tends to justify itself, to explain its own reasoning so the audience will follow along. A line meant only for the writer can skip all of that and go straight to the command. Get up, do the work you are for, stop complaining. Because no one was watching, nothing needed to sound wise. Later readers, from Renaissance humanists to modern soldiers, found uses in these private notes that Marcus never intended, borrowing a stranger's discipline as scaffolding for their own. It only needed to work, that night, on the one man reading it. Each night, after the lamp in his house was put out and the household had gone quiet, the philosopher Seneca sat with his own day and asked it questions. He described the habit in his essay on anger, written to his brother, explaining that he examined his entire day, going back over what he had said and done, hiding nothing from himself and passing over nothing. He judged himself, he wrote, the way a strict but fair observer would. What fault have you cured today? What weakness have you resisted? In what way are you better? The practice was private, unwitnessed, and repeated nightly for years, roughly 2,000 years before anyone called it journaling. Seneca was explicit about the tone required. This was not self-punishment. Anger at oneself defeated the purpose, since a mind bracing for attack tends to lie to protect itself. The examination worked, he believed, only when conducted calmly, the way a doctor reviews a case rather than a judge handing down a sentence. He credited the method to the philosopher Sextius, a Roman teacher he admired, who apparently practiced the same nightly review and reported that it left him able to sleep because his own conscience had already finished its accounting for the day. There is something practical buried in the timing, reviewing the day at its actual end before sleep dissolves the details, catches specifics that would blur by morning. A sharp word spoken at noon, a task quietly avoided, a moment of unearned pride, each gets named while it is still fresh enough to name accurately. Modern therapists studying the reflective habits of resilient people have since described something close to the same structure. a nightly accounting private enough that honesty costs nothing. Seneca kept no ledger, wrote nothing down that survives. The record lived only in the review itself, repeated the next night, and the next. Benjamin Franklin once built a small book for the sole purpose of catching himself failing. In his autobiography, he describes conceiving a bold and arduous project, as he called it, of arriving at moral perfection, and then immediately designing a system to track the attempt. 13 virtues, among them temperance, silence, order, and humility, each assigned close scrutiny for 1 week at a time, before moving to the next, cycling through the full list roughly 4 times a year. He ruled a page for every day, and every evening he reviewed the day and marked a small black dot beside any virtue he had violated. The goal was a clean week, a page with no dots at all. Franklin admitted this almost never happened. He was, by his own account, astonished to find himself so much fuller of faults than he had imagined, and the dots kept appearing even on virtues he thought he had already mastered, order proving especially stubborn for a mind as restless as his. Rather than abandon the project, he adjusted his expectations. A faultless life, he decided, might be unreachable, but the effort to reach it still made him a better and happier man than he would have been without it. He compared himself to someone trying to keep an axe uniformly bright by constant grinding, who settles for a speckled axe rather than a perfectly polished one, and judges the speckled result still worth the grinding. He kept the practice going for decades, on and off, carrying a small ivory tablet version of the chart, so he could mark faults in pencil and wipe it clean each week. Franklin later admitted that order, of all 13 virtues, gave him the most trouble throughout his life, joking that a naturally disorderly man might do better simply admitting the fault than fighting a battle he seemed destined to keep losing. The dots were never meant to accuse him, they were only meant to be counted. What could a scientist possibly learn from a walk he had already taken 1,000 times before? Behind his house in the village of Down, in Kent, Charles Darwin wore a path into the earth by walking it nearly every day for more than 3 decades. He called it the Sandwalk, a looping quarter-mile route through a strip of trees he had planted himself along the edge of a neighbor's field, and he walked it once or twice most mornings, sometimes more, when a problem needed working through. To keep count of his laps without breaking his train of thought, he kept a small pile of flint stones at the start of the path and kicked one aside with his walking stick each time he passed, so the counting happened in his feet rather than his head. His son later recalled watching him from a window, pacing the loop with his dog beside him, visibly turning some question over without ever seeming to notice the scenery he had walked past 1,000 times before. Much of the reasoning behind On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, took shape on this exact loop, alongside decades of work on orchids, earthworms, and human expression that followed. The path offered no new information each day. That seems to have been the entire point. A route that requires no attention frees the attention for something else, and a body already occupied with the small automatic work of walking leaves a mind unguarded enough to let difficult ideas rearrange themselves without being forced. Darwin was in poor health for much of his adult life, and the walk also served as one of the few forms of exertion his body reliably tolerated. Visitors to Down House today can still trace the same loop through the trees he planted, an ordinary circuit that offered no scenery worth photographing. The flints are gone now, but the loop at Down House is still walkable, still the same quarter mile, still going nowhere in particular. Before sitting down to compose, Ludwig van Beethoven reportedly counted out exactly 60 coffee beans by hand for every single cup, no more and no fewer. The detail comes down to us mainly through Anton Schindler, an associate and early biographer, who spent time in Beethoven's household and later wrote about his habits, along with corroborating recollections from other visitors who described watching the count happen at the table. Whether Beethoven hit 60 with literal precision every morning of his life, or whether the story tightened into a cleaner number through decades of retelling by admiring contemporaries, is impossible to settle at this distance. Schindler himself is a source historians treat with some caution, known to have embellished other details of Beethoven's life. What is not in serious doubt is that the ritual existed in some consistent form and that it mattered to him. Coffee itself was an ordinary drink across Vienna at the time, What stands out is the deliberate, almost ceremonial precision layered onto something so plain. A counted ritual performed the same way each morning asks very little of the mind in the moment, yet it draws a clear boundary between the hours of ordinary life and the hours reserved for work, the way a small locked gate marks a garden without needing to be tall. Beethoven, who battled encroaching deafness for much of his adult life and worked in famously erratic obsessive bursts once composition began, may have needed exactly this kind of fixed anchor, precisely because so much else in his working days refused to hold still. Later composers and biographers found their own versions of the same instinct, small fixed procedures performed before the real labor begins, though few have survived in as specific a form as Beethoven's bean count. The precision may say less about coffee itself than about a mind that distrusted its own settling into a working mood without some deliberate threshold to cross first. 60 beans, counted by hand, then the cup, then the work. In 1665, bubonic plague swept through London and reached Cambridge, and the university closed its doors and sent its students home. Isaac Newton, then in his early 20s, returned to his family's farmhouse at Woolsthorpe and stayed there, on and off, for close to 2 years, largely alone, with no laboratory, no tutors, and no one expecting results from him on any particular schedule. In that stretch of empty time, he laid the groundwork for calculus, worked out early experiments in optics using prisms and sunlight let through a shuttered window, and began the thinking that would eventually become his theory of gravitation. He later called it his annus mirabilis, Latin for his year of wonders, though the productive stretch actually ran across parts of 2 separate years. There was no research program handed down to him, no colleague checking his progress, no publication expected at the end of it. Cambridge simply was not open, and the ordinary machinery of academic life had stopped. What filled the gap was unstructured attention, sustained for months at a stretch, on problems he had chosen for himself, rather than been assigned. Newton was already an unusually solitary and intense thinker before the plague ever reached Cambridge, so the isolation did not create his mind so much as it removed everything that had been competing with it: lectures to attend, disputations to prepare, the low hum of other people's expectations. He returned to Cambridge in 1667 once the danger passed, and the ideas he had shaped in his mother's house on rented time kept unfolding into finished work for decades afterward. Nobody had asked him to spend those 2 years that way. The plague eventually eased and Cambridge reopened, and Newton returned to ordinary academic life as though the interruption had been unremarkable, saying almost nothing about it publicly for years afterward. Nobody was going to notice if he wasted them. Aristotle's school in Athens, founded around 335 BC at a gymnasium called the Lyceum, became known to history as the Peripatetic School, a name drawn from the Greek word for walking about. Ancient sources describe him leading discussions with his students while pacing the covered walkways of the grounds, rather than sitting them down in front of him the way a modern classroom assumes teaching must happen. Accounts differ on whether the school's name came directly from this habit or from the covered walkway itself, called a peripatos, but the association between Aristotle's method and motion held firm in how later writers remembered him. Students were expected to move alongside him, listening and questioning while their bodies stayed active, and the arrangement blurred any firm line between the hours set aside for thinking and the hours set aside for exercise. Modern researchers have since found measurable support for the old association. Studies on walking and creative thinking, including work published by researchers at Stanford in 2014, report that steady, undemanding walking measurably boosts performance on tasks requiring open-ended idea generation compared with sitting still. Nobody in Aristotle's Athens had that data, but the design of his school suggests the observation was already available to anyone paying attention to their own mind at work. Sitting still tends to focus attention narrowly on one fixed point, which suits certain kinds of concentrated analysis. Walking, by contrast, seems to loosen that focus just enough to let stray connections surface unbidden, connections a fixed chair and a fixed gaze might have kept buried. Aristotle apparently built an entire method of philosophy around the difference. The walkways of the Lyceum gone, Roman writers who studied at similar walking schools centuries later described the same restlessness in reverse, complaining that a lecture delivered while seated felt somehow less trustworthy than one delivered on the move. The habit of pacing while thinking hard never quite left. Leonardo da Vinci left behind thousands of pages of notebooks, most of it unread by anyone else while he was alive. On a single page he might sketch the muscles of a shoulder, work out the mathematics of a canal lock, describe how water curls around an obstacle in a stream, and rough out a design for a flying machine. The entries crowded together in his distinctive mirror script, written right to left, so that it only reads correctly held up to a glass. There was no single patron demanding this material, and no publisher waiting on it. Much of it followed no project at all, only the direction of his own curiosity on a given day. He dissected human bodies to understand anatomy in a level of detail that would not be matched in printed anatomical texts for generations, filled pages with studies of turbulence and flowing water that modern fluid dynamics researchers still find genuinely startling in their accuracy, and drew mechanisms for flight that had no hope of being built with materials available in his lifetime. Almost none of it saw print while he lived. The notebooks scattered after his death in 1519, some lost outright, others surviving in fragments collected centuries later by different owners across different countries. Observation performed with no obligation to publish behaves differently than observation aimed at an eventual paper or patron. There is no need to simplify a finding for an audience, no pressure to finish one line of study before a deadline forces a move to the next, no incentive to hide a dead end instead of recording it plainly alongside everything else. Da Vinci followed water, then bone, then air, then water again, answering to no one but the question in front of him. Much of what he saw, no one else saw again for centuries. What is the point of writing a letter you already know you will never send? After a battlefield failure or a bruising clash with a subordinate, Abraham Lincoln sometimes sat down and wrote exactly what he thought, in full, then folded the letter and put it away unsent. Historians have identified several of these, including a sharply worded letter to General George Meade after the Union Army let Robert E. Lee's forces escape across the Potomac, following Gettysburg in 1863. Lincoln laid out his frustration in detail, sealed the letter, and it was found among his papers after his death, never delivered. His secretary John Hiei referred to these as Lincoln's hot letters, and by most accounts Lincoln composed them fully aware, even in the moment of writing, that sending them would do more damage than good. Meade was already a general Lincoln needed for the war ahead. A furious rebuke on paper would have cost more than it settled, so the letter got written anyway with the same care and specificity as one intended for delivery, and then set aside. What is notable is that the writing still happened in full, not as a draft abandoned halfway, but as a complete considered statement of grievance, argued out to its own conclusion. Something about the sentence finishing itself on paper seemed to finish the anger along with it, in a way that simply stewing over the same grievance apparently could not. The letter did its work on the one person who read it. Lincoln, by every account from those closest to him, moved on afterward, and dealt with Meade evenly without the coldness the unsent draft might have guaranteed had it actually been mailed. Historians studying Lincoln's presidency have noted a broader pattern behind this one letter. A man managing an unprecedented war while surrounded by generals he could not simply replace, who seemed to have found almost by accident a private outlet that let him say the unsayable without paying for it. The paper absorbed what the moment could not safely hold. A student who has practiced for decades can look at a familiar object and truly see it as though for the first time, at least according to one strand of Zen teaching. The Japanese term for this is shoshin, meaning beginner's mind, and it describes an attitude of approaching even well-worn subjects with the openness of someone encountering them fresh. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki, who brought this idea to a wide American audience through talks collected in the 20th century, argued that expertise carries a quiet cost alongside its benefits. As a person becomes skilled, Suzuki suggested, their mind narrows around what has worked before. They stop noticing details that do not fit their existing categories, because those categories now do most of the noticing for them. A beginner, by contrast, has no such filter. Everything is new, so everything gets looked at. Suzuki's now well-known line captured the trade plainly. In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. This runs against the ordinary assumption that skill only accumulates, adding layer upon layer, with nothing lost along the way. Suzuki was not arguing against expertise itself, and he did not ask students to forget what they had learned. He was pointing at something narrower, that the openness of not knowing is itself a useful state, one that trained minds tend to lose without noticing the loss. Some contemporary teachers who studied under him described deliberately returning to simple, familiar tasks, a walk, a meal, a scale practiced on an instrument, and trying to meet them without the automatic gloss of familiarity. Whether this is fully achievable is an open question. A trained mind cannot simply switch off its training, but the discipline of trying, of asking what an old task would look like, seen without assumptions, is treated in this tradition as something to be renewed on purpose, again and again, rather than something a person naturally holds on to over time. The mind that has seen something many times is often the mind least likely to see it clearly. Ask an expert a simple question in ancient Athens, and there was a fair chance Socrates was standing nearby, waiting to ask a second one. He was known throughout the city for a habit that struck many of his contemporaries as strange, even irritating. He claimed repeatedly, and apparently sincerely, that he knew nothing of importance. According to Plato, who recorded many of these encounters, this was not false modesty, but a working method. Socrates would approach someone with a public reputation for wisdom, a general, a poet, a craftsman, and ask them to explain the very thing they were supposed to understand best: courage, piety, justice, skill. Through a patient sequence of further questions, a technique later generations would call the Socratic method, the person's confident definitions would begin to contradict each other, and the gaps in their thinking became visible, often to themselves as much as to onlookers. Plato's account in the Apology describes the origin of this habit. A friend of Socrates asked the oracle at Delphi whether anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the oracle answered no. Socrates, doubting this, went looking for someone wiser and questioned politicians, poets, and artisans in turn. Each seemed to possess real knowledge in a narrow craft, but believed wrongly that this made them wise about much larger matters too. Socrates concluded that his own advantage was thin but real. Where they thought they knew and did not, he at least knew that he did not know. This stance was not comfortable to be around, and it may have contributed to the resentment that led to his eventual trial and execution in 399 BCE. But it opened something that confident certainty tends to close off, a willingness to keep questioning an answer that feels finished. What Socrates modeled was not the absence of knowledge, but the refusal to stop looking once an answer felt settled. Seneca, advisor to the Roman Emperor Nero, and one of the central voices of Stoic philosophy, gave a friend an unusual piece of advice in one of his letters. Set aside a handful of days now and then to eat the plainest food, wear the roughest clothes, and sleep on the hardest bed available. Then ask yourself honestly whether this was truly the thing you had spent so much energy fearing. The practice had a name among later readers of Stoicism: voluntary discomfort, a deliberate, time-limited brush with the very hardships a person spends most of life trying to avoid. Seneca's reasoning was practical, rather than austere for its own sake. He observed that people fear poverty, hunger, and loss largely in the abstract, building up dread of conditions they have never actually tested. A short, chosen encounter with plain food or a hard bed, he argued, replaces that abstract dread with direct information. This is what it actually feels like, and it is survivable. The fear, once tested against experience, tends to lose some of its grip. Seneca was not recommending permanent poverty or self-punishment. He continued to live comfortably by most accounts, and the practice was meant to be occasional, a kind of rehearsal rather than a lifestyle. Other Stoic writers, including Epicurus, described related exercises aimed at the same target: comfort treated not as an enemy, but as something worth stepping away from on occasion, so that its absence stops feeling catastrophic. The underlying logic extended beyond material comfort to loss more broadly. If a person can tolerate a night on a hard floor by choice, the Stoics reasoned, they have learned something true about their own capacity that no amount of worrying could have taught them. The lesson was not that hardship is good, but that most fear of hardship is worse than hardship itself. A fear that has been tested against real experience rarely frightens in quite the same way again. A busy Vienna cafe in the 1920s gave the psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik an odd little puzzle. She noticed that waiters could rattle off the details of a large, complicated order with no trouble at all, right up until the bill was paid, at which point the same order vanished from memory almost entirely. Zeigarnik, working within a research group studying perception and thought, turned this observation into a series of formal experiments. She gave people a batch of small tasks, simple puzzles and simple assemblies, and let them finish some while interrupting others partway through. Afterward, participants recalled the interrupted, unfinished tasks noticeably better than the ones they had completed. This pattern became known as the Zeigarnik effect, and later researchers have found it holds up in a range of settings, though the size of the effect varies depending on how the task and the interruption are set up. The proposed explanation involves a kind of mental tension. An unfinished task keeps a small amount of attention circling back to it, as though the mind treats completion as a stopping signal and withholds that signal until the job is actually done. A finished task can be filed away, an unfinished one keeps nudging. Writers, including Ernest Hemingway by his own account, have used this tendency on purpose, deliberately stopping a day's work mid-scene or even mid-sentence, rather than at a natural close, so that the unresolved thread pulls them back to the desk the next morning, instead of leaving them to face a blank page cold. The same logic shows up in ordinary life whenever a half-sent email or a paused show occupies more mental space than it seems to deserve. The task you left half done is still working, quietly, somewhere behind whatever you are doing now. Why might a surgeon mid-operation or a rock climber partway up a difficult route have no real idea what time it is? The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying this kind of total absorption, a state in which a person becomes so engaged in what they are doing that hours pass without their notice and self-consciousness seems to fall away. He called it flow, and it was the subject of hundreds of interviews he conducted with artists, surgeons, chess players, and climbers about the moments when their work felt most effortless and most alive. What emerged from this research was a fairly specific condition. Flow tended to appear at a narrow point where the challenge of a task closely matched a person's existing skill, not comfortably below it and not far beyond it. A task too easy for a person's ability produced boredom. A task too far beyond it produced anxiety or simple avoidance. Flow lived in the band between the two, a zone that shifts constantly as a person's skill grows, meaning a task that once produced flow can quietly become boring once it is mastered. This creates a practical difficulty, since staying in that narrow band requires a person to keep raising the difficulty of what they attempt, or seek out new challenges entirely just to keep pace with their own improving skill. Csikszentmihalyi's subjects describe managing this in different ways: a climber taking on a harder route, a surgeon choosing more complex cases, a musician moving to more demanding pieces, each recalibrating the challenge as their ability changed. The state itself, by most accounts in his research, could not be forced directly. It arrived as a side effect of getting the difficulty right, not as something pursued head-on. Flow is less a destination than a moving target, always resting just past what you can already do easily. By the middle of an ordinary day, a particular kind of attention starts to run thin, the sort that lets a person consciously ignore distractions and stay focused on a task that does not hold their interest on its own. The psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan called this directed attention and proposed that it behaves something like a muscle. Heavily used, it tires, and once tired, it grows harder to summon even for simple things. Their attention restoration theory, developed through studies comparing how people felt after walks in parks against walks through busy city streets, suggested that certain environments let this tired form of attention recover, while others keep draining it further. A city street demands constant small acts of directed attention, watching for traffic, filtering noise, navigating other people. A natural setting, the Kaplans argued, asks for a gentler kind of attention instead, one drawn effortlessly toward things like moving leaves, running water, or clouds, without requiring the mind to work at ignoring anything. They termed this softer pull fascination, and considered it one of four conditions, alongside a sense of being away, an environment with enough scope to explore, and a fit between the setting and what a person wants to do there. that together let directed attention rest and rebuild. Subsequent studies, including work measuring performance on attention tasks before and after nature walks, have generally supported the pattern, though researchers still debate exactly how much of the effect comes from nature itself versus simply from lower demands and less noise. The theory does not claim that natural settings are inherently superior in some mystical sense, only that their particular visual and sensory patterns happen to ask very little of the part of the mind that spends the rest of the day being asked for everything. Somewhere between the trees and the water, the mind finds a kind of attention it does not have to fight to keep. Confidence, according to the psychologist Albert Bandura, is built far less by encouragement than most people assume. Bandura, whose research on human motivation spanned much of the 20th century, argued that a person's belief in their own ability to succeed at a given task, a concept he named self-efficacy, meaning simply a person's confidence in their own capability, comes primarily from a track record of direct personal success, not from cheerful words offered by someone else. Praise and pep talks in his framework sat well below actual accomplishment on the list of things that reliably build this kind of confidence. Bandura identified several sources that fed into self-efficacy, including watching similar people succeed and hearing persuasive encouragement, but he ranked what he called mastery experiences, a person's own remembered successes, as the strongest and most durable source by a wide margin. His research suggested a practical consequence. People who deliberately engineer small, achievable wins for themselves, rather than jumping straight to an ambitious goal, tend to build a form of confidence that holds up under later pressure, while people relying mainly on positive thinking or external cheerleading tend to see that confidence crack the moment things get difficult. The effect also compounds over time. An early success changes how a person approaches the next attempt, often making them more willing to persist through difficulty, which in turn produces more successes to draw on. Bandura's studies extended this idea into clinical settings, where patients working through specific fears were guided through small graduated successes rather than confronted with the full fear all at once, with measurable improvements in both confidence and behavior. The pattern he documented suggests that what a person believes they can do is to a significant degree a running tally of what they have already done. A history of small completed things has a way of quietly setting the ceiling on what a person later dares to attempt. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus wants to hear the song of the sirens, a sound said to lure sailors to wreck their ships on the rocks, without losing his ship in the process. His solution is to have his own crew bind him to the mast before the ship comes within earshot, with strict orders to ignore any pleading or command he gives once the song begins. He hears the sirens, the ship sails safely past. Decision researchers and philosophers later borrowed this scene as shorthand for a particular kind of self-management, now generally called a Ulysses Pact, an arrangement a person makes with themselves or with someone else in advance, specifically to restrict their own choices at a future moment, when temptation, exhaustion, or bad judgment is expected to take over. The logic depends entirely on timing. Odysseus does not try to resist the sirens through willpower in the moment. By the time their song reaches him, he has already removed his own ability to steer. The pact is made by the version of a person who can still see clearly, on behalf of the version who predictably will not be able to. Modern examples of the same structure are common enough to be unremarkable. Automatic transfers into a savings account before the money can be spent, apps that lock a phone for a set period, a person handing their car keys to a friend before a night of drinking begins. Behavioral economists, including Richard Thaler and others, have studied these arrangements formally, generally finding that pre-commitment devices work better than relying on in-the-moment self-control, precisely because they do not ask a tempted person to be strong. They ask a clear-headed person to plan ahead. The method concedes something most people are reluctant to admit about themselves. Somewhere in every Ulysses Pact is a quiet confession that the person making it does not fully trust who they will be an hour from now. For hundreds of years, a serious reader was expected to keep a second book alongside whatever they were currently reading, a personal notebook known as a Commonplace Book, into which they copied by hand the passages, quotations, and observations that struck them as worth keeping. The practice stretched from antiquity through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, and it was common enough among educated readers that the philosopher John Locke wrote an entire guide on how to organize one, complete with an indexing system for finding a passage again later. The Christian scholar Erasmus recommended the practice to students as a basic discipline of serious reading, not an optional flourish. A commonplace book differs from a diary in one essential respect. It is built almost entirely from other people's words rather than the keeper's own. A line from a sermon might sit beside a passage from a Roman historian, which might sit beside a proverb overheard in conversation, all arranged not by source or bait, but by whatever private categories the keeper found useful, subjects like grief, or courage, or the behavior of kings. The organizing logic belonged entirely to the person keeping the book, which meant that two commonplace books built from the same reading could end up looking nothing alike. What copying a passage out by hand seems to do, according to those who kept the practice up over years, is slow reading down to the speed of writing, forcing a kind of attention that skimming never requires, and turning a sentence encountered once into a sentence handled twice. The words were not just read, they were reproduced, letter, by the same hand that would later flip back to them. A copied sentence, unlike a merely read one, has already been written twice before anyone thinks to call it a favorite. What happens to a thought the instant someone writes it down right beside the sentence that caused it? Some readers do not stop at the last page to form an opinion. They form it in the margin, in ink, while the thought is still moving. This habit has a name: marginalia, the notes a reader leaves beside a text rather than after it. Pierre de Fermat, the 17th century French mathematician, did this constantly in his copy of an ancient Greek text called the Arithmetica by Diophantus. Beside one problem he wrote that he had found a marvelous proof of a certain claim about numbers, but that the margin was too narrow to contain it. He never wrote it out elsewhere. That single note, left almost as an aside, became known as Fermat's last theorem, and it took mathematicians 3.5 centuries to prove he was right, with Andrew Wiles finally completing a proof in 1994. What makes marginalia different from an essay or a diary is timing. The thought is captured exactly where it occurred, attached to the sentence that caused it, not smoothed over later into something tidier. A reader who argues with the author in the margin, who writes disagree or exactly or this cannot be right beside a paragraph, is doing something an essay written afterward cannot quite replicate. Reading is turned into a live exchange rather than a one-way delivery of information. Fermat was not writing for an audience. He owned the book. The notes were his own workspace, not a performance. Scholars have found the same habit across centuries, in the marginal notes of readers from monks to poets, some of them more revealing of a mind at work than any finished book the same person published. The habit asks something of a reader that skimming does not: a willingness to stop mid-sentence and answer back. A margin note outlives the mood that produced it, waiting on the page for whoever opens the book next. Somewhere in the Andes, a Prussian naturalist stopped to take a barometer reading he did not strictly need. Humboldt did this constantly. Beginning in 1799, he spent 5 years traveling through Central and South America, and he brought with him an elaborate kit of instruments: barometers for air pressure, thermometers, a cyanometer for measuring the blueness of the sky, devices for magnetism, and tools for judging altitude with precision. He used them everywhere, not only at moments that seemed scientifically important. Climbing toward the summit of Chimborazo in present-day Ecuador in 1802, reaching higher than any European had recorded before him, he still paused to record temperature, humidity, and the elevation at which particular plants stopped appearing. That last detail mattered more than it might sound. By comparing plant life across different mountains and continents, Humboldt began to see vegetation not as a fixed local catalog, but as a pattern shaped by climate and altitude, connected across the globe. This became one of the seeds of ecology, the study of how living things relate to their environment and to each other, decades before the word existed in its modern sense. Humboldt's journals ran to thousands of pages of numbers, sketches, and cross-references, and his insistence on measuring constantly, rather than only when a result seemed likely, is part of why his data still holds up. He could not have known in advance which reading would matter. Historians of science, including Andrea Wolff, have argued that this relentless, almost mechanical habit of recording is what let Humboldt see connections that a more selective observer would have missed entirely, because the pattern was never visible in any single measurement, only across thousands of them, taken without knowing yet which ones counted. The mountain did not change. What changed was how many numbers someone was willing to write down before deciding an idea might be true. A count who owned thousands of acres spent his mornings walking behind a plow. Leo Tolstoy, already the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, began in his 50s to work the land at his estate, Yasnaya Polyana, alongside the peasants who farmed it for a living. Visitors recorded seeing him mowing hayfields for hours in the summer heat, dressed plainly, keeping pace with laborers half his age. He was not performing for an audience passing through. The habit continued on ordinary days when no one of note was watching. Tolstoy connected this physical labor directly to the moral and religious convictions that were reshaping his life during this period, a turn towards simplicity, humility, and suspicion of the privilege his title and wealth afforded him. He wrote about manual work as a kind of honesty, a way of eating bread he had earned rather than bread that arrived because of his birth. His wife Sophia and much of Russian society found the habit strange and at times embarrassing for a man of his standing. Some visitors described the sight of a famous count sweating in a field as almost theatrical, though those closest to him insisted the labor was sincere rather than staged. Nothing required Tolstoy to do this. His status as a writer and landowner was secure, regardless of how he spent his afternoons, and the fields would have been plowed by others whether he joined them or not. He kept at it for years, through seasons of writing and seasons of family strain, treating the physical tiredness of a day's mowing as something closer to a spiritual discipline than a chore. The habit did not make him a better novelist. It seemed, by his own account, to make him feel less like a fraud. Tolstoy's name is remembered for the books he wrote at a desk, not for the hours he spent choosing, again and again. On a mountain outside Kyoto, a small number of monks have taken on a physical trial that stretches across 7 years without pause. The monks belong to the Tendi school of Buddhism, based on Hiei, and the practice is called kyuhogyo, a term that translates roughly as circling the mountain. In its fullest form, a monk commits to 1,000 days of walking and running a set mountain route, spread across 7 years, covering distances that add up to a path long enough to circle the globe. During the most demanding stretch, a 9-day period, the monk goes without food, water, or sleep while continuing to chant. Along the route, the monk stops at hundreds of designated points to pray, treating the mountain itself as a temple with many small altars rather than one building. Historical accounts, including those gathered by scholars of Japanese religion such as John Stevens, describe fewer than a few dozen monks completing the full 1,000-day course in the modern era. Within the Tendi tradition, the practice is not framed as an athletic feat or a test of willpower for its own sake. It is understood as a form of moving meditation, a way of enacting the Buddhist path with the whole body rather than only the mind, and monks who undertake it traditionally carry a short sword, a mark of the expectation that they will complete the vow or not return. The training is watched closely by the temple and built up gradually over years rather than attempted all at once. What the practice asks is not speed or strength in isolation, but the willingness to keep a single vow, day after day, long after the original resolve that started it has had to be renewed many times over. Few who have heard of kyuhogyo could describe its full 7 years from memory, and fewer still could say they understood, from the inside, what kept a monk returning to the mountain path on the 1,000th day. A monastery can be full of people and nearly empty of sound. Monks of the Trappist order, formerly known as the Cistercians of the Strict Observance, have historically organized their communities around a discipline that sharply limits ordinary speech, reserving words for prayer, chant, and only the conversation that daily life truly requires. In place of casual talk, many Trappist communities developed a working vocabulary of hand signs, allowing a monk to ask for bread at the table or signal the time of a task without breaking the quiet. The silence was never treated as emptiness. It was built, deliberately, as a structure, a removal of the low constant noise of small talk, so that something else, prayer, work, and attention, had room to occupy the space that talk usually fills. Visitors to Trappist monasteries, including writers such as Thomas Merton, who lived as a monk at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, have described the quiet as startling before it becomes restful, an adjustment that takes days rather than minutes. The habit of constant low-level talk, it turns out, is not neutral background. Removing it changes how a mind occupies itself, and many visitors report a kind of mental static in the first day or two, the mind reaching for a conversation that is no longer there. Modern Trappist practice varies from house to house, and the strictness of the old rule has loosened in many communities over the past century. But the underlying premise has held across that change, that speech left unchecked tends to fill every available silence, and that a life is different once that filling stops. Merton himself wrote at length about this adjustment, describing his early weeks at the monastery as an almost physical withdrawal, the mind casting about for a conversation partner that the rule had quietly removed from the room. What is left, once the talking stops, turns out to be most of what a day is actually made of. How do you get an entire community to rest at the very same hour every single week without asking any one person to find the willpower to decide it fresh? The Jewish Sabbath, or Shabbat, answers with 1 day in 7, running from sundown on Friday to nightfall on Saturday. And during those hours, work of many defined kinds simply does not happen, regardless of deadlines, harvests, or how anyone happens to feel that week. The practice traces back to the biblical book of Genesis and is written directly into Jewish law, making it one of the oldest continuously observed rhythms in recorded history, older by a wide margin than the modern weekend. Because the day is fixed on the calendar in advance and observed by an entire community together, no individual has to negotiate it fresh each week. A person does not need enough willpower on a Friday evening to decide, unassisted, that today is a day to stop. The decision was made once, collectively, generations ago, and the structure simply repeats. This is different in kind from the rest a person arranges alone, which depends on that person noticing exhaustion, having the authority to pause, and choosing rest over whatever feels urgent in the moment. 3 conditions that often fail at once, precisely when rest is most needed. A shared scheduled stop removes all 3 obstacles at once, since the day arrives whether anyone feels ready for it or not. And since everyone around a person is observing the same pause, the social pressure that normally pushes work forward goes quiet along with it. Rabbis and scholars over centuries have described the Sabbath less as a break from productive life, and more as a separate order of time, governed by different rules than the other 6 days. A rest that does not ask permission tends to arrive. A rest that waits for the right moment often does not. In the spring of 1845, a writer in Massachusetts picked up an axe and began building a 1-room cabin in the woods. Henry David Thoreau built the cabin near Walden Pond, on land owned by his friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, outside Concord, and moved in that July, staying a little over 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. He described his purpose plainly in the book that came out of the experiment, Walden, published in 1854. He went to the woods, in his words, to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and to see whether he could learn what living had to teach before facing the end of it with regret at having never truly lived. This was not a retreat into wilderness for its own sake. Concord was a short walk away, and Thoreau received visitors and walked into town regularly. The experiment was about subtraction. He built the cabin himself for a little over $28, grew a small bean field, and kept detailed, almost accountant-like tables of his expenses and his hours, tracking down to the cent what a simplified life actually cost to sustain. What he found, by his own account, was that most of what people spend their lives earning is spent servicing possessions and obligations that were never necessary in the first place, and that once the ordinary clutter of furniture, food variety, and social upkeep were stripped away, the hours remaining were startlingly many. He used them to read, to observe the pond through its seasons, and to write. Thoreau left Walden in 1847, saying he had other lives to live and did not want to spend too long on just one. Walden Pond is still there, and the arithmetic Thoreau ran beside it, of hours spent against things actually needed, still adds up the same way for anyone willing to do it. Before a plan begins, some teams pause to declare it already dead. The psychologist Gary Klein, who spent decades studying how experienced professionals such as firefighters, pilots, and battlefield commanders make decisions under pressure, formalized this into a method he called the pre-mortem. A team about to launch a project is asked to picture a specific scene. The project has failed completely, and the date is some months in the future. Working backward from that imagined failure, each person on the team writes down every plausible reason it might have happened, independently, before comparing notes. Klein's research, along with work by the psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who wrote favorably about the technique, suggested that this framing draws out concerns that the same people would hold back if asked directly whether the plan might fail. The reason has to do with how groups behave once a plan is already underway and morale is invested in its success. Raising a doubt at that stage can look like disloyalty or pessimism, and most people, sensing that, quietly edit their concerns down to nothing rather than voice them. A pre-mortem removes that cost entirely, because failure is no longer a doubt one person is raising against the group's optimism. It is the shared premise everyone has been asked to work from, which makes naming a specific risk feel like problem-solving rather than dissent. Teams that have used the method report surfacing risks, budget assumptions, unclear ownership of a task, a dependency nobody had confirmed, that were fully known to individuals beforehand, but never said aloud in an ordinary planning meeting. Nothing about the underlying risks changes when a pre-mortem is run. What changes is only whether anyone is willing to name them before it is too late to matter. Optimism is useful for starting a project and nearly useless for finding out in advance what might stop it. Warren Buffett has owned shares of Coca-Cola since 1988 and has not sold them since. This is not an isolated habit. Several of the largest holdings in his company, Berkshire Hathaway, have sat untouched for decades, bought once and then left alone through recessions, market crashes, and years of results that looked at times unremarkable. Most participants in financial markets operate on a far shorter horizon, holding a stock for months, or with the rise of algorithmic trading for fractions of a second, treating a purchase as a bet on where a price will move next. Buffett has described his own approach differently and consistently over decades. Buying a stock, in his view, means buying a small piece of an actual business, and a piece of a good business is worth holding for as long as the business stays good, regardless of what its price does in the meantime. He has attributed his results less to special insight into any single company and more to a willingness to do very little for a very long time. A discipline he says is simple to describe and unusually hard to practice, since sitting still while others trade constantly can look from the outside like doing nothing at all. A short horizon changes what looks worth doing. Quarterly earnings, daily price swings, and news cycles all become relevant if a position might be sold next month. They become close to irrelevant if a position is meant to be held for 20 years, and Buffett has said plainly that he tries to ignore nearly all of it. That shift in horizon does not just change how long he holds a stock. It changes at the outset which businesses he is willing to buy into at all, since a company only qualifies for decades of patience if he believes with real conviction that it will still be worth owning that far out. A decision meant to last 20 years and a decision meant to last 20 minutes rarely look the same, even when they are on paper the exact same purchase. Theodore Roosevelt stood before a Chicago audience in 1899 and told them that a life of ease was not worth the striving. Comfort, he said, built nothing. What built something was difficulty, chosen on purpose. He had reason to believe it. As a boy, Roosevelt was sickly and asthmatic, kept from ordinary childhood by a body that seemed to fail him at every turn. Rather than accept that condition, he rebuilt himself through boxing, weightlifting, and long hours on horseback, then carried the same instinct into ranching in the Dakota Badlands, into military service with the Rough Riders in Cuba, and later into an expedition through the Amazon, so punishing it nearly killed him. Roosevelt called this outlook the strenuous life, and he meant it as more than a personal habit. He framed it as a civic argument. Nations, like individuals, grew soft when they stopped asking anything hard of themselves. Where most people treat hardship as a cost to be minimized, something to survive on the way to comfort, Roosevelt treated it as a kind of fuel, sought out because of what it produced, rather than endured despite it. That distinction runs through the whole of his biography. He did not stumble into difficulty. He went looking for it, on ranches and battlefields and rivers with no name yet on a map. Historians still debate how much of this was genuine philosophy and how much was a restless man's temperament dressed up in language. But the pattern in his choices is not in dispute. The speech that named the idea was delivered to a room of veterans and businessmen, and Roosevelt used it as much to warn his own country as to describe his own habits, worried that comfort at a national scale would soften a people the way it had once nearly softened him. The strenuous life asks a narrow question of any comfortable moment. What is this ease costing me? Why would anyone risk their life to climb a mountain that offers no reward at the summit beyond having climbed it? A reporter in New York asked George Mallory in 1923 why he wanted to climb Mount Everest. He answered simply, because it is there. Mallory was already a veteran of 2 earlier British expeditions to the mountain, and by 1924 he was back for a third attempt, this time with a young climbing partner named Andrew Irvine. On the 8th of June that year, the 2 men were spotted through a break in the clouds, high on the northeast ridge, moving toward the summit. Then the clouds closed, and neither man was seen alive again. Mallory's body was not found until 1999, 75 years later, resting on the mountain's north face. Irvine's has never been recovered. Whether the 2 men reached the top before they died, 9 years ahead of the expedition credited with the first confirmed ascent, is a question climbers and historians still argue over, since no camera was recovered and no account survived to settle it. What has outlasted the mystery is the answer Mallory gave before he ever left England. Reporters pressed him for something more, a reason with a payoff attached: national pride, scientific value, personal glory. He offered none of those. The mountain existed, and that, in his framing, was reason enough to go toward it. People have tried for a century to read ambition or philosophy into those 5 words, and the phrase has been stretched to cover every kind of pursuit since. But Mallory said it about one mountain, once in answer to one question. Climbers who followed him up the same route in later decades have spoken of the answer almost as a private test, repeating it to themselves at moments when a more practical justification would have been easier to reach for and would have explained far less. No one has ever improved on his answer, only borrowed it. A boy entering a medieval guild might not touch the trade's finest work until he was nearly a grown man. Across European craft guilds, from goldsmiths to weavers to stonemasons, apprenticeship typically ran 7 years or longer, and for some trades it stretched well beyond that. The arrangement was formal and binding. A contract, sometimes called an indenture, bound the apprentice to a master craftsman who provided food, lodging, and instruction in exchange for years of labor. Early apprentices swept workshops, hauled materials, and handled the least skilled parts of the trade, tasks with no glamour and no visible connection to mastery. Only gradually, as years passed, did a master introduce the finer techniques that defined the craft. And even then, the apprentice's work was closely supervised and often redone. At the end of the term, many guilds required a demonstration piece, literally a masterpiece, judged by senior craftsmen, before the apprentice could advance to journeyman status, and eventually, if his work held up, to master himself. None of this timeline was left to the apprentice's own sense of readiness. The guild set the years in advance, regardless of how quickly a particular boy seemed to learn, on the assumption that certain judgment and physical skill could not be rushed, no matter how sharp the student. Impatience had no official standing in the system, only time served and work judged by others did. In many cities, the guild also limited how many apprentices a single master could train at once, keeping the instruction close and personal, and a master who mistreated an apprentice or taught carelessly could be brought before the guild and stripped of the right to train again. A craft, the guild seemed to assume, is not something a mind decides it has learned, but something a body earns the right to be trusted with. Socrates did not tell people what to think. He asked them what they already believed, and then asked them to defend it. In Plato's dialogues, this pattern repeats with striking consistency. Socrates approaches someone confident in their understanding of a concept, justice, courage, piety, and simply asks them to define it. When they offer a definition, he asks a further question that tests its edges, then another, until the definition collapses under its own contradictions. He rarely announces what he thinks the right answer is. The dialogues most often end not in a tidy conclusion, but in aporia, a Greek term for a state of puzzlement, with both Socrates and his conversation partner left uncertain, though newly aware of exactly where their certainty had been false. This was not a debating trick aimed at winning. Ancient sources describe Socrates comparing himself to a midwife, someone who does not implant ideas but helps draw out and test the ones already present in another person's mind. The discomfort of that process fell on the student, not on Socrates, and he seemed to view this discomfort as essential rather than regrettable. A person handed a correct answer can accept it or ignore it, without ever examining why they believed otherwise. A person walked, question by question, into the contradictions of their own position, has nowhere left to stand except to rebuild. That difference between receiving a conclusion and losing one's footing on the way to it is what the method seems built to produce, and it made Socrates, by several ancient accounts, a deeply unwelcome presence at Athenian dinner tables. Xenophon, another student who left his own record of Socrates, described the same method used more gently on ordinary craftsmen and soldiers rather than public figures, suggesting the approach was less a performance for an audience than a habit Socrates carried into every conversation he had. A good question can do what a correct answer cannot. It can make someone feel the ground shift under a belief they never thought to check. Inside a Seattle apartment built specifically for the purpose, cameras once recorded married couples doing nothing more dramatic than arguing about dishes. The psychologist John Gottman ran this observation lab, sometimes nicknamed the Love Lab, for decades, watching couples talk through both mundane disagreements and deeper conflicts while he and his team logged their expressions, tone, and timing in minute detail. Out of that mountain of footage came a term Gottman used for something small and easy to miss: the repair attempt. A repair attempt is any gesture, verbal or physical, aimed at breaking the momentum of rising tension before it turns into something harder to walk back. A joke dropped into a tense silence, a hand placed on an arm, a deliberate change of subject, even an exaggerated sigh that breaks the mood enough to let both people laugh. Gottman's research, along with that of his collaborator and wife Julie Gottman, found that the couples who stayed together and stayed satisfied were not the ones who avoided conflict. They fought, sometimes often. What set them apart was how quickly one partner offered a repair attempt and how readily the other accepted it, rather than pushing past it to keep the argument going. Couples on the way to separation tended to let these small offers pass unanswered, a pattern that compounded quietly across years of otherwise ordinary disagreements. A single ignored joke or unreturned touch means little on its own. It is the habit, repeated across hundreds of small disputes over a marriage's lifespan, that eventually shows up as the difference between a partnership that bends and one that breaks. Gottman's team eventually grew confident enough in the patterns they were seeing that they could often tell, from watching a short conversation, which couples were more likely heading toward real trouble, though the skill they were tracking was never really about avoiding disagreement in the first place. A relationship's strength seems to live less in whether the argument happens, and more in the small hand extended somewhere in the middle of it. In 1969, the French writer Georges Perec published a complete novel, La Disparition, without once using the letter E. The constraint was not a gimmick attempted for a few pages. La Disparition runs some 300 pages entirely without the most common letter in the French language, a restriction that forced Perec to abandon entire categories of ordinary vocabulary, including, notably, most ways of referring to himself in French. Perec belonged to Oulipo, short for Workshop of Potential Literature, founded in Paris in 1960 by the writer Raymond Queneau and the mathematician François Le Lyonnais. Its members, a mix of novelists, poets, and mathematicians, shared an unusual premise: that strict, self-imposed rules did not limit creative work so much as redirect it into places it would not otherwise have gone. A writer facing a blank page with total freedom tends to reach for familiar sentences, the phrasing already sitting closest to hand. Remove one letter from every sentence available, and those familiar phrasings become impossible. The writer is pushed, word by word, into constructions no one, including the writer, would have chosen on purpose. Perec later wrote a companion piece using almost nothing but the letter E, as if testing the method from its opposite extreme. Other Oulipo members built novels around mathematical permutations, chess problems, or fixed poetic structures borrowed from centuries earlier, each treating the rule not as a cage, but as a kind of key. Perec was not the first to test a constraint this severe, but earlier lipograms had been treated as minor curiosities rather than sustained novels, and his achievement was proving the trick could carry a full plot and characters, instead of collapsing after a few clever pages. Translators faced the same problem in turn. The English version, prepared by the translator Gilbert Adair under the title Avoid, had to avoid the letter E as well, a second constraint stacked on the first. The empty page rarely forces a writer anywhere. What can a hand learn by repeating someone else's exact brushstrokes hundreds of times before it is ever trusted with one of its own? For generations, a painter's education did not begin with a blank canvas. It began with someone else's finished painting. Students in European academies and private studios, from the Renaissance workshops of Florence through the 19th century salons of Paris, spent years reproducing existing works before they were permitted to attempt original compositions of their own. A student might set up an easel in the Louvre and spend weeks on a single copy of a painting by Titian or Rubens, matching brushstroke to brushstroke, working out through the hand what could not be fully explained in a lecture, how a particular painter built up shadow in layers, or mixed a certain flesh tone, or arranged a composition so the eye lands where intended. Workshops run by masters such as Peter Paul Rubens relied on this same principle in reverse, with apprentices copying the master's own work so closely that scholars today still argue over which surviving paintings were made by Rubens himself and which by a skilled hand in his studio. The practice assumes something particular about how technical skill actually enters a person, not through description but through repetition, the same motion performed enough times that the hand begins to anticipate what the eye has only recently learned to see. A verbal explanation of brushwork can be understood and forgotten within a day. 100 hours spent copying that same brushwork tends to stay lodged somewhere words do not reach, which is presumably why the practice survived, largely unchanged for centuries after it might have seemed replaceable. Some academies formalize the practice into a fixed curriculum, requiring a student to complete a set number of copies at an approved standard before being allowed to submit any original work for evaluation at all. And masters judge those copies as strictly as any finished painting submitted for a prize. What the copying built was never the copy itself, but the hand that made it. Some households in ancient Rome kept a small skull in plain sight, set on a shelf or a table where it would be seen every day. The object was called a memento mori, a Latin phrase meaning remember that you must die, and it functioned less as decoration than as a scheduled interruption, something the eye would land on in the middle of an ordinary task and be forced, briefly, to reckon with. The habit of mind behind the object outlasted the Romans by well over 1,000 years. Stoic philosophers such as Seneca wrote openly about keeping death in daily view, arguing that a clear sense of life's limit sharpened rather than dampened a person's judgment about how to spend the time actually available. Christian monastic communities in medieval Europe carried the practice forward in their own form, with some monks reportedly greeting one another with the reminder that they would die, and skulls appearing again centuries later in the still life paintings of the Dutch Golden Age, positioned deliberately among fruit and flowers and fine objects as a quiet counterweight to all that abundance. None of these traditions treated the reminder as morbid in the way the modern ear might expect. The purpose was closer to a sorting function, with a fixed, finite amount of time made visible rather than assumed. Certain pursuits lost their appeal quickly, while others, previously crowded out by lesser obligations, became harder to keep putting off. The Roman writer Petronius described a dinner host who had a small silver skeleton brought to the table between courses, tilting its jointed limbs into different poses while guests ate, a theatrical version of a habit that in quieter households needed no performance at all to make its point. A single object, glanced at daily, seems to have been enough to keep a life honest about what it was actually for. Set a calendar from nearly any major religious tradition next to another, and a pattern appears. Each one independently builds in a fixed time to stop eating. Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, calls for a 25-hour fast observed on a specific date each year. Ramadan, observed by Muslims worldwide, sets aside an entire lunar month during which food and drink are abstained from between dawn and sunset. Lent, kept across much of Christianity, marks a period of roughly 40 days before Easter, traditionally associated with fasting and simplified eating. These traditions developed largely apart from one another, across different centuries and regions, yet arrived at strikingly similar structures. Not an open invitation to fast whenever a person feels drawn to it, but a specific window, fixed on the communal calendar, observed by an entire community at the same time. That detail seems to matter as much as the fasting itself. A private fast undertaken alone, on a day of one's own choosing, is a personal decision that can be postponed, reconsidered, or quietly abandoned without anyone else noticing. A fast observed by an entire community on a fixed date carries none of that flexibility. The date arrives regardless of mood or convenience, and everyone observing it does so together, which turns an individual act of restraint into a shared one, reinforced by the people practicing it alongside you. Historians of religion have noted this convergence across traditions that had little or no contact with one another for much of their early history. Anthropologists studying fasting across these traditions have noted that the shared timing also changes what the abstention means socially, turning private hunger into a visible, collective marker that neighbors and strangers alike are observing the same day for the same reason, whether or not they know each other at all. The date on the calendar, fixed and shared, appears to do work that willpower alone was never asked to do. The Camino de Santiago has been walked for over 1,000 years, and many who set out on it still cover hundreds of kilometers on foot before they are done. That is not a weekend errand. It is weeks, sometimes over a month, of sore feet, shared hostels, and one long road pointed at a cathedral in Spain. What is notable is how rarely pilgrims describe the difficulty as a flaw in the design. Blisters, exhaustion, and bad weather are treated less as obstacles to endure and more as part of what the walk is for, wearing down the noise of ordinary life until something quieter underneath has room to surface. Traditions from a wide range of cultures have built the same structure independently. A defined route, a fixed destination, and a length of time too long to rush. The Hajj to Mecca, Buddhist circuits around sacred mountains in Japan, and Christian routes across medieval Europe all share this basic shape, even though their theologies differ sharply. Historians who study pilgrimage, including Victor Turner, have argued that the physical separation from home and routine, what he called liminality, a threshold state between one's old life and whatever comes after, is doing real psychological work, not just symbolic work. A private decision made in an armchair can be reversed by dinner. A vow made on day 1 of a 3-week walk has to survive day 2, day 10, and the day the traveler's feet give out before it can be tested against a destination in the distance. The repetition of footsteps, one after another for hours, seems to occupy the part of the mind that would otherwise spin in place, leaving whatever question the pilgrim carried to work itself out sideways rather than head-on. Something about putting a body through hardship on the way to an answer seems to make the answer, once it arrives, harder to walk back from. Postage was slow in the 1700s, and a letter crossing from Paris to Philadelphia might take 2 months to arrive. Enlightenment thinkers built an entire intellectual culture on top of that delay anyway. Historians now call this sprawling, informal network the Republic of Letters, scholars, scientists, and philosophers across dozens of countries, writing to one another directly, often without ever meeting face to face. Voltaire corresponded with rulers and fellow writers across Europe. Benjamin Franklin exchanged letters with scientists in London and Paris on subjects ranging from electricity to trade. These were not brief notes. A single letter might run for pages, laying out an argument, anticipating objections, and inviting a reply that would not come for weeks. Since formal publishing was slow, tightly controlled by censors in many countries, and expensive to arrange, a direct letter to a sharp, informed reader was often the fastest real test available for an idea. A scholar in Amsterdam could send a half-formed theory to a correspondent in Edinburgh and receive back genuine pushback, not flattery, months later, then revise and send it out again. Over years, this built something a single conversation never could, an idea refined by dozens of independent minds across national and religious lines, each reading closely because a reply was expected and a reputation was on the line. The Republic of Letters had no headquarters, no membership list, and no single language, though Latin and French did much of the work. It ran instead on the discipline of writing back, carefully, again and again, to people its members would very often never see in person. Even rivals in politics or religion often kept up cordial exchanges of ideas through this network, treating correspondence as a space set apart from the disputes that divided them in public life. A shared page passed slowly across a continent did work that no single room full of people could have matched. What if every single transaction had to be written down twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, with no exceptions ever allowed? That is the entire idea behind double-entry bookkeeping. And in 1494, the Italian mathematician Luca Pacioli set out the method in careful written detail for the first time. He had not invented it. Venetian merchants had been keeping their books this way for generations, refining the practice through ordinary trade. Pacioli's contribution was to describe it clearly enough that it could travel beyond the merchants who already knew it by habit. The method requires that each transaction be entered as both a debit and a credit in two separate places, so that the books only balance if both entries agree. A sale of goods increases one account and decreases another by the exact same amount every single time, with no exceptions. If the two sides ever fail to match, an error has been made somewhere, and the mismatch itself points toward where to look. Pacioli did not present this as tedious clerical busywork. He wrote about accuracy in record-keeping as something close to a moral obligation for a merchant, arguing that a trader who could not account clearly for money had no real business handling it. The system spread from Venice across European trade networks over the following centuries, and it remains, with only modest changes, the backbone of how modern businesses record their finances. What double-entry bookkeeping demonstrates is a habit of building the check into the task itself, rather than trusting a single pass to be correct. A ledger that must agree with itself catches mistakes a single tired clerk, however careful, would likely miss. Pacioli was better known in his own lifetime as a mathematician and a friend of Leonardo da Vinci, who illustrated one of Pacioli's later books, and the bookkeeping treatise was only one section within a much larger mathematical work he published. 4 centuries on, the same doubled ledger still catches the same kinds of errors it always did. Before paper was cheap, and before memory could be outsourced to a notebook, a speech had to live entirely in the mind of the person giving it. Ancient Greek and Roman orators developed a technique for holding long, complex speeches in memory without a single written cue, the method of loci, from the Latin word for places. The idea is to mentally walk a familiar route, a house, a temple, a street of shops, and set each point of the speech down at a specific spot along the way. To recall the speech, the speaker simply walks the route again in imagination, gathering each idea from where it was left. The technique is traced back to the poet Simonides of Chios, who, according to legend, once identified the bodies of banquet guests crushed in a collapse by recalling exactly where each person had been sitting at the table. Cicero later described the method in detail as a working tool for Roman orators who might need to hold an entire legal argument in mind for a court appearance, with no notes allowed. What seems to matter is not the walking itself, but the placing. Attaching an idea to a distinct imagined location appears to give the mind a hook that a repeated phrase alone does not provide. Modern memory competitors, who compete to memorize decks of shuffled cards or long strings of digits, still train using versions of the same method, sometimes calling it a memory palace. Neuroscientists studying these competitors have found that they rely heavily on brain regions associated with spatial navigation, the same systems that let a person find their way home, repurposed for holding information instead of geography. A speech scattered loosely through the mind tends to slip. A speech laid down room by room along a route the mind already knows tends to stay. A single monk might spend the better part of a year copying one book by hand, letter by letter, in a room built for exactly that purpose. Medieval monasteries set aside such rooms, called scriptoria, where scribes sat for hours at slanted desks, working from an existing manuscript to produce a new copy with pen, ink, and parchment. The pace was unhurried by necessity. A page rushed was a page more likely to contain an error that would then be copied again by the next scribe down the line. Across a working life, a scribe might complete only a handful of full manuscripts, religious texts most often, but also classical works by Roman and Greek authors that monasteries chose to preserve alongside scripture. The work was understood inside the monastery as a form of devotion, not merely labor performed to pass the time. Copying scripture by hand, slowly and attentively, was treated as its own kind of prayer, a way of dwelling inside a sacred text, rather than simply reading past it. That slowness turned out to matter for reasons the monks themselves could not have fully anticipated. Original manuscripts decayed, burned, or were lost to war and neglect over the centuries, and in a great many cases, the only reason a text survived at all is that a monk somewhere had already copied it before the original was gone. Works by authors such as Cicero and Aristotle exist today largely because of this chain of patient duplication, passed from scriptorium to scriptorium across generations. Speed could have produced more copies in less time, at the cost of more errors compounding with each pass, and there would have been no guarantee that any single copy survived the centuries between the monk's desk and ours. A book copied slowly enough to be understood turned out to be a book built to last. A problem gets set aside, and somehow it keeps working without you. In 1926, the psychologist Graham Wallas proposed a 4-stage model of creative thought. Preparation, where a person gathers information and works the problem directly. Incubation, a period of stepping away from it entirely. Illumination, the moment a solution surfaces, and verification, checking whether it actually holds up. The stage that puzzled Wallas most was incubation, because by definition nothing conscious is happening during it, and yet something inside the process clearly continues. Mathematicians, composers, and writers have long described solutions arriving not at the desk, but on a walk, in the shower, or in the drowsy minutes just before sleep, often long after they had consciously given up on the problem for the day. The mathematician Henri Poincaré described boarding a bus, his mind on other matters entirely, when a solution he had been chasing for weeks simply arrived, fully formed, with no sense of having worked for it in that moment. Modern cognitive scientists studying this effect point to processes that continue below conscious awareness, sometimes called unconscious or offline processing, though researchers still debate exactly what the brain is doing during that gap and how much credit incubation itself deserves versus simple rest from mental fatigue. What does seem consistent across the accounts is the shape of the pattern: hard, direct effort first, then a deliberate release of the problem, and only after that release does the answer tend to surface, uninvited. The composer Paul McCartney has described a comparable experience with a melody that arrived complete in a dream, and mathematicians recalling their own breakthroughs often describe the same oddly passive sensation, as though the answer had been assembled somewhere out of view and simply handed over once it was ready. Stepping away from a problem does not appear to be the same as abandoning it. Outside the walls of Athens, the philosopher Epicurus bought a garden and moved in, along with a small community of people he had chosen to live and think alongside. The community was unusual for its time in a specific way. It included women and enslaved people as genuine participants in philosophical life, at a moment when most schools of thought restricted themselves to free men of standing. Epicurus argued that a reliable circle of friends, chosen with care and kept close through ordinary daily contact, mattered more to a good life than wealth, fame, or political power, all of which he considered far less dependable. This was not an abstract position he simply wrote down and moved past. He built an actual household around it, arranging his own daily life so that friendship was structural, rather than incidental, present by design rather than left to whatever happened to survive a busy schedule. Members of the garden ate together, discussed philosophy together, and supported one another through illness and hardship, treating the maintenance of those relationships as a central task of living well, rather than a pleasant activity fitted in around more serious business. Epicurus' surviving letters return often to friendship as something requiring deliberate tending, not unlike a garden itself, which does not stay cultivated without steady attention. The school he founded continued for centuries after his death, run by successors who kept the same basic arrangement of shared, chosen community. Ancient critics outside the school found the arrangement suspicious, assuming a mixed household of this kind must be driven by scandal rather than philosophy. But the surviving testimony from those who actually lived there describes something closer to a disciplined, almost monastic routine built around shared meals and shared study. Most people let friendship happen wherever it happens to fit. Epicurus built his entire household around making sure it did not have to compete for space at all. What would you want to say to a descendant who will not be born for another 50 years? Some letters are written to people who do not exist yet. Long before the modern legal will became a standard document, families in a number of cultures kept a different kind of will alongside it, one concerned with values rather than property. Historians call these ethical wills, letters passed down through a family, not to distribute money or land, but to hand along memories, hard-won advice, and a sense of what the writer hoped their descendants would carry forward. The tradition has documented roots in Jewish customs stretching back many centuries, where a parent might write to children or grandchildren addressing how to live rather than what to inherit. And versions of the same practice have appeared under different names in other cultures as well. Unlike a legal will, an ethical will carries no binding force whatsoever. No court enforces it, no estate depends on it, and the person writing it stands to gain nothing material in return. Whatever value it holds exists only in whether the words are read and remembered. Some were written during ordinary times, as a kind of running letter added to across years. Others were written in illness, or in old age, by someone taking stock of what they had learned and did not want to see disappear with them. What makes the tradition unusual is the intended reader, often a grandchild not yet born, a great-grandchild the writer will never meet, someone who exists only as a future possibility at the moment the pen touches the page. Rabbis in the medieval period sometimes encouraged the practice explicitly, treating the writing of such a letter as a final act of teaching. One more lesson delivered after every other opportunity to teach in person had run out. A document like that asks for nothing back because its reader was never expected to answer. When Alexander was 13, his father decided that the ordinary options were not good enough for him. Philip II of Macedon could have sent his son to an existing school, as most families of means did, but instead he arranged for Aristotle, then one of the most capable minds in the Greek world, to come to the royal court and tutor Alexander directly. The arrangement lasted several years, reportedly conducted partly at a retreat away from the distractions of the palace, where Aristotle instructed Alexander in philosophy, medicine, logic, and the natural sciences, alongside the literature and politics expected of a future king. Aristotle had himself studied under Plato, who had studied under Socrates, placing Alexander at the end of a direct chain of instruction, running back 3 generations to the beginnings of Greek philosophy itself. Historians still debate exactly how much of Aristotle's teaching shaped Alexander's later decisions as a conqueror and ruler, since the surviving evidence is thin, and much of it was written well after the fact by admirers on both sides. What is not in doubt is the choice Philip made, and what it signaled, that the education of an heir was not a matter to leave to whichever school happened to be nearby, but a decision worth the trouble of bringing the finest available teacher to the student instead. Few fathers in the ancient world had the means to make that kind of choice at all. Philip's decision cost him politically as well as financially, since bringing a philosopher of Aristotle's stature to Macedon meant competing for his time against wealthier and more established courts that might otherwise have claimed him first. Fewer still, given the means, would have judged a teacher worth the trouble of moving the mountain to the boy, rather than the boy to the mountain. 45 habits, and not one of them was a secret. That may be the strangest part of all of this. Nothing on this list required money, permission, or an unusual amount of luck. A private notebook, a repeated walk, a margin left unfilled until someone chose to write in it. A day fixed on a calendar so firmly that no one had to decide, each week, whether they still felt like resting. Ordinary materials, arranged with slightly more attention than most people bother to give them. It would be easy to end here with a lesson, some tidy instruction about which of these 45 habits to adopt first, but that was never really the point of gathering them together. Marcus Aurelius did not write for you. Darwin did not walk his garden path so that a stranger, centuries later, could learn something from it. Tolstoy did not plow his fields as an example for anyone. Each of these people were simply living, in their own particular way, paying attention to something most people around them had already stopped noticing. What separates an ordinary life from an extraordinary one may have less to do with any single habit on this list, and more to do with a willingness to keep such a habit going, long after its novelty wore off, through the mornings it felt pointless, through the years no one else was watching, through the long ordinary stretch of time where most people quietly give something up. Perhaps that is the only real thread running through all 45, not discipline exactly, and not genius, but a kind of patience with small, repeated things. A notebook kept a little longer than it needed to be, a walk taken one more time than felt necessary, a silence held a moment past comfort. Whatever shape a wiser life eventually takes, it seems to be built this way, quietly, habit by habit, on ordinary days no one else happened to be watching.